Right. Okay. Well, thank you for agreeing to go through this coaching session with me. We're going to go ahead and get started. And so I'd like to start by having a conversation about your classroom context. So if you can share with me a little bit about your learning environment, what is your current setting, a little bit about your students. I know that we've been in session for, this is our third week, right? So what can you tell me about your classroom and your students in a general sense, and then we'll zoom in on some specifics.
Well, we're obviously completely online. I have 24 students. I have them, I think, 5 times a week, 5 periods a week. And as of right now, we're starting off. We just finished all of our kind of assessments, our diagnostics, and then we're getting started with content. So we're starting with plot and kind of an overview, but also delving into analysis to hit that 8th grade standard. And then we're also delving into theme later this week.
So we're talking about an 8th grade English language arts class, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We have 24 students in that class. So you mentioned assessments or diagnostics. What are some of the key findings or learnings that have surfaced so far about your students, and what kind of assets or what kinds of things they might need a little bit more support with?
So for reading, I do have a generally lower class. A lot of them are in the red lower level, so like intervention level. Same thing with writing. After the diagnostic, they have a lot of just mechanics and grammar even to just go over. And then with reading as well, it was kind of all over the place with the reading, but generally there was some patterns. The average was about, I think, up 40 to 50% overall on Common Lit, with standards such as interaction of ideas in nonfiction text, and then also central idea in nonfiction. So I think there's some work to be done with nonfiction, because even with fiction, it was a little bit low, but the lowest ones were the nonfiction areas, the nonfiction standards.
I see. Okay. So you mentioned that you started plot, and you're going to move into what is it that you're going to move into next?
We're moving into theme.
Okay. So that's how, because you mentioned also nonfiction seems to be a need, right? So how do you plan to integrate that into your what you identified as a need for your students based on the lesson that you're in right now?
That's a good question.
Well, something that
I think
later. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna hit on specifically informational text later, with the exception of obviously like instructions and stuff like that, like reading, being able to just read through instructions, which I found is also kind of a need with this class.
Okay.
But because I'm kind of going along with the pacing guide, the department pacing guide, we're going over a little bit of fiction first, and then the way that I'll integrate nonfiction is definitely through their writing in general. They're going to be writing like explanatory text. Even with this theme lesson, they're going to be writing an explanatory informational paragraph about what the theme of the text is.
Okay. So I see that you're already looking for opportunities and intersections and thinking ahead in terms of what they need so that you can make those connections visible for them. Okay, very good. So let's, so do you tell me a little bit about some of your student subgroups and if anything has surfaced from those assessments? You don't have to give me their names specifically, but for example, if you do have students with IEPs or you have any emergent bilinguals or ELs in your classrooms, in your current setting, what have you learned about them, and what are some things that you're thinking about in terms of supports and interventions as you move into the deeper parts of your lesson?
I think it's still pretty early, and to be honest, it's been difficult in the virtual setting to even get them to like speak to me even get them to, they'd rather type it in the chat, and always in the chat, it's full of, grammar errors, and, sometimes it's incoherent. But so it's been a little bit difficult with the data as well, because it's pretty scattered and the entire class is generally pretty low. It's usually easier in person to see, the responses that you get, the way they elaborate in their answers during a discussion. That usually helps me so much to get a grasp on like where they are, even with their speaking skills. And it's been so hard to just get them to, share out loud and during any discussions that we've had.
Right. So what I'm hearing you say is the engagement piece, right? And not engagement for the sake of, are you sitting there listening to me per se, but how are we engaging or dialoguing with each other as the lesson goes on? And even with the chat in this setting, I think can be a little challenging, right? Because you're not there physically to actually interact with them. So I guess one of the things that that maybe we can explore a little bit more is looking for some other engagement tools and opportunities as we move deeper into your lesson. Okay, very good. So let's shift a little bit into your own reflections and your teaching practice and experience. So now that you have this information about your class and some assessment pieces, tell me a little bit about your own teaching practice. I know that, again, this is a different setting, so what you thought maybe before was working or you understood may be a little different now. So let's explore that a little bit. What are some things that have challenged you, or some things that you've experienced success with maybe?
I mean, there's a lot of challenges. Like I said, the engagement, it is getting better. And I think it's important to still attempt to get my enthusiasm across, like through the screen, like, hey guys, I really love what I'm teaching, and I really, I'm trying to still show my personality over, the computer. And I think that has been helping with engagement, because now I'm feeling at the end of last week and this week, I do get a little bit more responses, or just more openness to answering and not being afraid to get the answer right or wrong. Or so I think that's one of my I mean, it's been a success in a sense, but also a challenge, is just trying to create that same like safe learning environment.
Right.
So that's one of the challenges, but also just having students interact with each other as well has just been a challenge, because again, some of them, they're not as engaged, or maybe they are, but they don't want to be seen. So it's hard to feel like a whole class all at once sometimes because of that. And then the other thing is just checking for understanding, I think, has been a little bit tough. And in general, for me, is just, I always set goals, and I like to, or I try to work towards that, and I shape my lessons to reach that goal. And I would like to get the students involved and to get them and help them be more aware of what our goal is, because it is our goal, like mine and theirs. And they should be a little bit more aware of that. And that's just been kind of hard, I guess. But it's still pretty early, so I haven't really, set like long-term goals or anything for students specifically.
Okay, so it sounds like you want to be able to provide your students with some clarity in terms of the learning outcomes, right? And so that's been something that has worked with you before. But again, in this new setting, how do you do that when you have the kids in front of a screen, right? And you can't break them, not necessarily in the same way, because you can do the breakout rooms, right? But put them in groups and then have to check in with them. But students tend to be a little more reserved, right? When they're online, they're not fully attending to, okay, I'm going to be in a breakout room and then I'm going to talk about what the teacher just gave me, because you're not going to be there the whole time, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate that you mentioned that you continue to have the same enthusiasm. I think that's important, right? And enthusiasm for what you're teaching hopefully will then transfer into their enthusiasm in waves sometimes, right? About what you're teaching, because you seem to exhibit that passion. So in thinking about what you just outlined in your practice right now, I'm wondering, what are some pieces of data, or what are some areas that you'd like me to focus on during the observation? And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to pull up the CSTPs. What we can do is we can identify an element, or actually identify the domain, and then sort of through that conversation, we can determine which of the elements you'd like to focus on. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right, so let me pull that up. Can you see the standards?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So you mentioned engagement a lot, right? And engagement does come up in quite a few of the standards, but I also heard you reference in some way how you plan for your learning experiences by being clear on your learning targets and your goals, right? So a lot of that probably has to do with how you design your instruction. So what standard are you sort of inclined towards having a conversation about?
I think 4-2.
Okay. So we're looking at planning instruction and designing learning experiences for all students, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so I'm curious, what specifically about 4-2 is it that you think you'd like us to focus on?
I think not, because usually I do a pretty good job at establishing these goals. I don't know if I always articulate them specifically and share them with the students. I often share the objectives, but I don't know if I've done quite a strong job or good job at sharing long-term goals with them and getting them involved in their learning. I think it also puts some of the accountability and agency in their learning when I tell them, like, this is my goal as a teacher to get you here, but it's also your goal as a student for this English class to achieve this, and this is what we are working towards as a team, it almost feels like. And I want to just give them a little bit more agency and awareness of that.
Wonderful. So actually, you make me, I'm wondering if when you present your goals for the day or for the week or whatever unit you're working on, how do you, in speaking about that agency and accountability, how do you ensure that the students come back to that goal and check on whether they were able to meet that goal or where they are in their journey in that particular area?
So for this year so far, what I've had is just quizzes at the end of lessons. And so once we get the results, and I share it with them individually, then before I share, I tell them, when you see your result, you're gonna get a sense of whether or not you met our objective and whether or not we met our objective.
Okay.
But it's been more of a lesson by lesson thing. And I feel like the long-term goals and objectives are something that I think would also be extremely beneficial for students, to give them sort of even just a visual of their learning journey, because sometimes it does feel, especially for this age group, it just feels like a lesson by lesson. It could even be like a minute by minute thing or an activity by activity thing. So I think maybe it'll also give them like a broader view of kind of what we're doing here in English class, even though, you know, especially with the virtual setting, it feels even more like abstract and distant.
Right, right. Okay, so let's get into, as it relates to this particular standard or element that we're going to be focusing on, let's talk about the lesson that I'm going to come in and observe. And so I'm curious about what kind of data points or what information would you like me to provide you with feedback on? You mentioned it a little bit about collecting student work, right? Whether it's an assessment or sort of that day to day. So I'm sure that we can pull from whatever the student has produced in that particular lesson. But first, start by telling me a little bit about the lesson that I'm going to be observing, and then what are some things that you'd like me to really zoom in on and give you feedback on as it relates to this standard. Is it okay if I stop sharing my screen and we can go into the next piece?
Yes. So the lesson's going to be kind of an overview of just what theme is. And then we're going to practice, because there's a common misconception and confusion between themes and ideas or motifs in literature. So I kind of want to address that before we go into determining the theme of the text that we've been reading for the week, which is Thank You, Ma'am. So just a little bit of practice with theme, and then they're going to work individually on determining the theme of Thank You, Ma'am. And this is going to be followed by them writing sort of a timed paragraph on what the theme is, and they'll be asked to include quotes